I always thought I had my life figured out. You wake up one day, go through the motions, work, home, responsibilities, and before you know it, years slip through your fingers like sand. Write in the comments where you're listening to us from. I never thought a little thing like that could ruin everything. I wish I'd seen it coming. My name is Rachel. I'm 36, and on the surface, my life seemed perfectly normal. Married, settled, living in Austin, Texas. But inside, I felt like I was watching my own life from the outside, like I was merely existing rather than living. That all changed last summer. My brother Josh and his wife Laura needed a weekend away and asked me to keep an eye on their son, Ethan. A responsible 19-year-old, fresh off his first year at the University of Texas. It was a simple favor. Just make sure everything's okay, they said. I imagined a quiet, uneventful couple of days, filled with junk food, lazy movies, and a bit of light reading. Ethan arrived that Friday evening, his usual easygoing smile in place, a backpack slung casually over one shoulder. "Hey, Aunt Rachel," he greeted, wrapping me in a quick hug. I hadn't seen him in months, and in that short time, he'd changed. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, carrying himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. It caught me off guard for a moment. Was this really the same kid who used to run around with shoelaces perpetually untied? The first night was lighthearted and easy. We ordered takeout, settled on a Marvel marathon, and ended up laughing way too much at the absurdity of some of the fight scenes. Ethan had this way of making sharp, hilarious observations that had me clutching my stomach with laughter. And I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was enjoying someone's company. Really enjoying it. Mark, my husband, had been so buried in work that our conversations had dwindled down to logistical necessities. Did you pay the electricity bill? Don't forget we need groceries. At some point, we had stopped actually talking to each other. But here, with Ethan, I was laughing, engaging, feeling present. Saturday started off just as relaxed. Ethan slept in, giving me a rare, quiet morning to sip coffee on the porch, catching up on emails. When he finally stumbled into the kitchen, his hair was a mess, and he yawned like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Afternoon, you mean?" I teased, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. He chuckled, shaking his head. Guess I needed it. The day passed in an effortless blur, more movies, random conversations, and a round of an old board game I hadn't touched in years. It was nice. I felt lighter. I wasn't thinking about the laundry list of things I needed to do. I wasn't dwelling on my increasingly distant marriage. By late afternoon, Ethan mentioned heading out to meet a friend. I barely looked up from my book when I told him to have fun. But I didn't hear him return. I was upstairs, sprawled out on my bed, watching a guilty pleasure reality show when my bedroom door suddenly creaked open. I forgot my keys," Ethan stammered from the doorway. I jolted upright, pulling the blanket instinctively around me, even though there was no reason to. He wasn't looking directly at me, his gaze darting around the room like he'd just walked into something he shouldn't have. "Ethan," I managed, my voice shaking a little more than I wanted it to. "You should knock." "I know. Sorry. I wasn't thinking." He stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over himself as he pulled the door shut behind him. For a moment, I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door. It was nothing, just an accident. But later that night, as we sat in the living room, pretending to focus on a movie, the air between us had shifted. And I had a feeling that nothing would be the same after that. I told myself it was nothing. Just an awkward moment. One of those fleeting, forgettable things that happen in life and disappear just as quickly. But the truth? The truth was I felt it. That strange, electric tension in the air when Ethan and I sat in the living room later that night, pretending to watch the movie playing on the screen. He was quieter than before, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by something more restrained. He wasn't making his usual sarcastic comments about the plot, wasn't cracking jokes.
And I wasn't looking at him the same way.
I could feel his presence beside me, too aware of the space between us, too aware of how close we actually were. I needed to break the silence. About earlier, I said, keeping my voice light, casual, like I wasn't thinking about it at all. It was nothing. Let's just forget it, okay? Ethan glanced at me then, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes I couldn't place. Something flickering, barely there. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then just nodded. Yeah. Sure, he said, turning his attention back to the TV. But neither of us were watching the screen. The night stretched on like that, heavy, silent, filled with something unspoken. I told myself it would fade, that by morning, everything would go back to normal. But I was wrong. The morning that changed everything. I woke up the next day later than usual, feeling disoriented. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of something playing downstairs. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, luring me out of bed. As I made my way to the kitchen, I found Ethan already there, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone with a steaming mug in hand. He looked up when he heard me, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, trying to ignore the way my stomach twisted at the sight of him standing there so comfortably, like he belonged. He pushed a fresh cup of coffee toward me. "Figured you could use one." I hesitated. It was such a simple thing, just coffee. But something about the way he did it, about the way he looked at me as he handed me the cup, made it feel different. Like it meant something more. "Thanks," I murmured, taking a sip, letting the warmth settle me. Ethan watched me for a moment, then finally spoke. "I just wanted to say about yesterday," he started, his voice steady, measured. "I didn't mean to make things weird." I forced a laugh, waving it off like it was nothing. "Ethan, it's not weird. It was just a misunderstanding." But the way he looked at me, the way his gaze lingered, it told me he didn't believe that. And deep down, neither did I. An unspoken invitation. The rest of the day carried on as if nothing had happened, but the awareness between us never faded. It was in the way our conversations felt too careful, in the way our glances lasted a fraction of a second too long. And then, in the late afternoon, Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me as I tidied up. "Hey," he said suddenly, shifting on his feet. "Wanna go for a drive?" I blinked. "A drive?"
Yeah.
I don't know. Get out for a bit." I hesitated. I should have said no. There was no reason to go anywhere, no reason to prolong whatever strange shift was happening between us. But I found myself nodding. "Okay, let me grab my purse." And just like that, I let myself step closer to the edge. Because deep down I knew this wasn't just a drive. This was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to stop. The moment I slid into the passenger seat, I knew I had made a mistake. Not because anything had happened yet. Not because there was anything explicitly wrong with getting into the car with Ethan. But because of the way it felt. Too easy. Too natural. Too intimate. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on the gear shift. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, casting golden streaks across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. I had known Ethan all his life, watched him grow up, but for some reason, I was seeing him differently now. Or maybe I had just been refusing to see it before. "Any particular destination in mind?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal. Ethan glanced at me, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Just driving. Unless you have somewhere you want to go." I shook my head, gripping my seatbelt a little tighter.
"No.
This is fine." We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the tires against the road filling the empty space between us. Outside, the Texas landscape rolled by, wide, open fields, the occasional gas station or diner passing in a blur. It should have been relaxing. But it wasn't. I was too aware of everything. The way his fingers tapped idly on the steering wheel. The way his scent, clean, fresh, with the faintest trace of cologne, seemed to fill the car. The way he occasionally glanced over at me, like he was waiting for me to say something. I swallowed hard. This had to stop. So, I said, my voice too loud, too forced. How's school going? Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Seriously? What? I shot him a look. You're doing that thing where you act like nothing's weird when we both know something's weird. I felt my stomach tighten. I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he pulled into an empty lookout spot on the side of the road. A wooden fence lined the edge of the cliffside, overlooking miles of untouched wilderness. It was beautiful, breathtaking even. But all I could focus on was the way he put the car in park and turned toward me, his expression unreadable. Rachel, he said, his voice quieter now. Can we just talk about it? I looked down at my hands, my fingers gripping the hem of my dress, like it was some kind of lifeline. There's nothing to talk about. Really? He tilted his head slightly, watching me. Because I feel like there is. I let out a shaky breath, finally forcing myself to meet his gaze. Ethan, whatever you think is happening, it's not. He didn't look convinced. Then why won't you look at me the same way you used to? My heart pounded against my ribs. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do, he said, and suddenly, he wasn't smiling anymore. I see the way you avoid my eyes now. How you act like everything is fine, but you're different. We're different. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan, this is ridiculous. Is it? He leaned slightly closer, and I hated myself for not moving away. Because I think you feel it too. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but nothing came out. Because the truth was I did feel it. That strange pull, that impossible tension.
It was suffocating. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying.
I turned away, looking out at the open landscape, trying to catch my breath. This is a mistake, I whispered. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, he said, Then why does it feel so real? The air between us felt thick, too heavy to breathe. I needed to leave. I needed to put distance between us before I did something I couldn't take back. I reached for the door handle, my fingers tightening around it like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. We should go back, I said, barely able to hear my own voice over the sound of my heartbeat. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't push. He just nodded slowly, jaw tight, before starting the car again. The drive home was silent. But nothing had changed. Because no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. We had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. The car ride home was painfully silent. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of Ethan sitting just inches away. My pulse was still erratic, my thoughts a tangled mess. I needed to get a grip. This was nothing. It had to be nothing. But when he finally pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, he didn't move. Neither did I. Seconds stretched into something heavier, thicker. Finally, I forced myself to break it. Thanks for the drive. My voice was too soft, too breathy, like I'd just run a marathon. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. You don't have to do this. I turned to look at him. Do what? Pretend like it didn't happen. I gripped the seatbelt harder, nails pressing into the fabric. Nothing did happen, Ethan.
His jaw tightened.
That's not what I mean. I knew exactly what he meant, but I couldn't let him say it. Not out loud. I unbuckled my seatbelt, reaching for the door handle with fingers that trembled more than I wanted to admit. We should go inside. Ethan didn't argue, but as I stepped out of the car, I could feel his eyes on me, burning. The second I walked inside, I was hit with the scent of something familiar. Mark's cologne, faint but still present.
Right.
My husband. I was married. I had a life, a home, a history with someone else. So, why did it feel like I was living someone else's life? I went straight to the kitchen, needing something, anything, to ground myself. I yanked open a cabinet, grabbed a glass, and filled it with water, ignoring the fact that my hands were still shaking. Behind me, I heard Ethan step inside. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. A few beats of silence stretched between us before I finally found my voice. "We need to stop this." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Stop what, Rachel?" My fingers tightened around the glass. "Whatever this is." "I don't even know what this is," he admitted, voice low. I forced myself to look at him then, and what I saw made my stomach flip. Because it wasn't uncertainty. It was conviction. Like he had already made up his mind about something I wasn't ready to name. I shook my head, trying to push through the haze in my mind. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You're my nephew." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Technically, not by blood."
Ethan.
My voice was a warning, but it didn't seem to matter. He pushed off the counter, stepping closer. Too close. "Tell me you don't feel it." I swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter what I feel." His eyes flickered, jaw clenching. "So, you do feel it." I turned away, pressing my hands flat against the cool surface of a counter. "It doesn't matter." Silence. Then, in a voice that nearly shattered me, he asked, "Then why are you shaking?" I squeezed my eyes shut. "You need to go upstairs, Ethan." He didn't argue this time. He just left. And when I finally dared to breathe again, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't relieved. I was disappointed. Mark came home late. Not surprising. It had become a pattern. Work dinners, last-minute meetings, the ever-growing distance between us. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't relieved by his absence. I needed him here. Needed something solid, something real. When he finally walked in, dropping his keys onto the counter, I forced a smile. "Hey, you hungry?" He glanced at me, surprised. "You cooked?" "No, but I can heat something up." Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I already ate." Of course he had. I nodded, trying not to let the rejection sting. "Long day?" "Yeah," he muttered, already scrolling through his phone. "Exhausting." I watched him for a moment, waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. Maybe for him to look at me. Really look at me. But he didn't. He just kept scrolling. I turned away, biting the inside of my cheek. "I'll be upstairs." Mark barely acknowledged me as I left. And as I climbed the steps, one slow foot in front of the other, I became aware of something else. Something worse. Ethan's door was slightly open, and he was watching me. Our eyes met for a single heartbeat. Then he closed the door. And just like that, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The weight of the evening pressed down on me as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Mark was next to me, already asleep, his back turned, his breathing slow and steady. The routine was so familiar, so practiced, it made my chest ache. I thought about the way Ethan had looked at me before he shut his door. The way my stomach had twisted, not in guilt, but in anticipation. What the hell was wrong with me? I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut. If I just focused hard enough, maybe I could pretend everything was fine. Maybe I could convince myself that today had been nothing more than a strange, fleeting moment. But then came the knock. Soft. Hesitant. Almost like the person on the other side wasn't sure if they wanted to go through with it. My pulse spiked. I glanced at Mark, still unmoving, completely unaware, before slowly, carefully, slipping out of bed. The floor was cold against my bare feet as I crossed the room, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I hesitated for half a second. Then I opened the door. Ethan stood there, barefoot, his hair slightly messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. The silence between us stretched, charged and heavy. I should have told him to go back to his room. I should have shut the door. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind me. He exhaled sharply, his eyes searching mine. Rachel. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't do this. He didn't back away. Then why did you open the door? I had no answer. I felt my back press against the wall before I even realized I was moving. Ethan was close now, so close I could feel the warmth of his skin, the tension in his breath. I could stop this. I could tell him to walk away. But I didn't. Because the truth was I didn't want him to. And that terrified me more than anything. The air between us felt too thick, too charged. I could hear the faint hum of the AC, the distant sound of cars passing outside, but inside this hallway, just inches from Ethan, everything else ceased to exist. I should have moved. Should have said something, anything, to break whatever spell was wrapping itself around us. But I just stood there, my back against the wall, my breath shallow. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Tell me to walk away, he whispered. I swallowed hard. Ethan? Tell me, he repeated, his voice lower this time, rougher. I opened my mouth. The words were right there. I knew what I needed to say, but I couldn't. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a humorless laugh. You can't, can you? I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temples. This is wrong. Then why are we here? I didn't have an answer for that. Something flickered in his expression, frustration, longing, something else I wasn't ready to name. He took a slow step back, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things harder for you. You already have, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between us, raw and unfiltered. Ethan took another step back, his lips parting slightly like he wanted to say something else, but instead, he just nodded. Good night, Rachel, he murmured. I watched him walk away, watched his door close. And I stood there for what felt like hours, my fingers pressed against the wall, my chest rising and falling in unsteady waves. I had to end this, had to set boundaries, had to remind myself who I was. But as I slipped back into bed next to Mark, his warmth familiar, his presence distant, I knew the truth. I had already crossed a line. And no matter how much I told myself otherwise, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. And the worst part? I wasn't sure Ethan did either. The next morning, I felt like I was moving through a fog. I went through the motions, coffee, laundry, pretending everything was fine. But nothing felt fine. My hands shook when I poured my coffee, my stomach twisted every time I heard movement upstairs. I avoided Ethan. Or maybe he avoided me. Either way, neither of us acknowledged what had almost happened in that hallway. I told myself it was for the best. By mid-afternoon, Mark was home. For once. He had the day off, something that used to mean something. Now, it just felt like a cruel joke, like the universe was giving me one last chance to fix things.
So I tried.
I was thinking, I said, forcing a bright tone. Maybe we could go out tonight. Just us. Dinner, maybe a movie? Mark barely looked up from his phone. Tonight? I nodded. Yeah, why not? He sighed, rubbing his temples.
Rachel, I'm exhausted.
Can't we just have a quiet night in? Something inside me cracked. A quiet night in. Like every other night. Like every other week. Like every other year. I forced a smile.
Yeah.
Sure. He kissed my cheek absently before disappearing upstairs. The moment he was gone, I gripped the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. I needed air. Stepping outside, I let the warm evening breeze hit my skin. The sun was starting to dip, painting the sky in streaks of pink and orange. I closed my eyes, inhaling deep, trying to remind myself who I was before this, before the tension, before the stares, before the thoughts I couldn't shake. And then I heard it. A voice. Low. Familiar.
Ethan.
I turned toward the sound, peering around the corner of the house. And what I saw made my breath catch. Ethan wasn't alone. A girl stood close to him, leaning in, laughing softly at something he'd said. She was younger than me, beautiful, confident, the kind of effortless charm I hadn't felt in years. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something far more dangerous. Jealousy. Ethan must have sensed me, because his eyes flicked up, locking onto mine. His smile faltered. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, as if making a point, he turned back to the girl and leaned in just a little closer. I felt sick. I didn't stay to watch whatever happened next. I turned on my heel, went back inside, and locked the door behind me. My heart pounded, my hands clenched into fists. This was good. This was what I needed. A wake-up call. A reminder that I had been a fool to think any of this meant something. I wasn't the woman he was chasing. I was just a mistake he hadn't made yet. Or so I thought. Because later that night, when the house was dark and quiet, there was another knock on my door. And this time, I knew exactly what would happen if I opened it. I stood there, staring at the door, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Another knock.
Soft.
Hesitant. I should have ignored it. Should have rolled over, shut my eyes, forced myself to pretend I didn't hear it. But I did hear it. And worse, I was waiting for it. I moved before I could stop myself, my fingers tightening around the doorknob. When I pulled it open, Ethan stood there, barefoot, his hair slightly messy like he had been lying awake for hours. His jaw was clenched, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't ready to name. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Can we talk?" I should have said no. Instead, I stepped aside. Ethan walked in, and I quietly shut the door behind him. I crossed my arms over my chest, a weak barrier between us. "Ethan, this has to stop." His lips pressed into a tight line. "Then why did you let me in?" I swallowed hard. Because I cut myself off, shaking my head. "I don't know." He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "I saw your face earlier." I froze. His gaze darkened. "When you saw me with her." Heat crept up my neck. "Ethan, I wasn't." "Yes, you were." His voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. "You were jealous." I turned away, my nails digging into my palms. "That's ridiculous." Ethan took a slow step forward. "Is it?" I could feel him behind me, close enough that the air felt heavier. "Rachel." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay strong. "Ethan, I'm married." He exhaled, and for a second, I thought he might step back. But then his voice came low, raw. "Does he even see you anymore?" My stomach clenched. "Does he look at you like you matter?" His voice was steady, too steady, and I hated that it was breaking me apart. "Because I do." I turned then, angry now, needing to put an end to this before it spiraled into something neither of us could take back. "Ethan, you're a kid."
His jaw tightened.
"I'm not a kid. You don't know what you're doing." His eyes flashed. "And you do." Silence. I was shaking. With frustration. With guilt. With something worse. Then, softer this time, like he already knew the answer, he asked, "Do you want me to stop?" I hated him for asking. I hated myself more for hesitating. My breath hitched. Ethan's fingers brushed against mine.
Just barely.
Just enough to make my pulse stutter. I should have pulled away. I didn't. Instead, I whispered the one thing that would ruin everything. "I don't know." And just like that, the ground beneath me gave way. And, the worst part, Ethan wasn't going to let me fall alone. Ethan didn't move at first. Neither did I. We stood there in the dim light of my bedroom, the silence between us pulsing like a second heartbeat. His fingers barely brushed against mine, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt up my spine, enough to make my breath hitch, enough to make me forget who I was supposed to be.
I could still stop this. I should stop this.
Instead, I whispered, "Ethan, we can't." His eyes flickered. "Then why are you still here?" I had no answer. He took a slow step forward, closing the last bit of space between us. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice low, controlled, but I could hear the tension coiled beneath the surface. "Tell me and I'll leave." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. His gaze searched mine, reading every thought I was too afraid to say. "You don't want me to leave." I let out a shaky breath. "This is wrong." He nodded. "I know." Another inch closer. His fingers grazed my wrist, the touch light, almost hesitant. My pulse pounded against his fingertips. "Ethan, I won't touch you unless you ask me to," he murmured.
"But you want me to."
I closed my eyes, willing myself to step away. Then we heard it. A noise. Distant, but unmistakable. The front door opening.
Mark.
Panic slammed into me. I stepped back, so fast I nearly stumbled. Ethan's eyes widened, but he moved just as quickly, slipping toward the hallway as I rushed to my bed, yanking the covers over me just as I heard my husband's footsteps climbing the stairs. The door creaked open. "Rachel." I turned onto my side, forcing my voice to stay even. There was a pause, then the sound of him sighing as he pulled off his jacket. "Did I wake you?"
"No, primelit."
"Long day," he muttered. I barely nodded, my body still rigid, heart racing. I could still feel Ethan in the room, in the air, in the space between what almost happened and what never should have. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing my pulse to slow. This was a wake-up call. It had to be, because next time, there wouldn't be a door creaking open to stop me. Or worse,
next time I might not want it to.
The next day, I avoided Ethan. Or maybe he avoided me. Either way, we moved through the house like two people pretending nothing had happened, like two people who hadn't almost destroyed the fragile line between right and wrong. Mark left early for work, pressing a distracted kiss to my forehead before heading out the door. When it shut behind him, I exhaled, my entire body deflating. I wasn't relieved. I was restless. I spent the morning cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, pacing from room to room as if moving would shake off whatever had taken root inside me. But no matter how much I tried to push it down, I could feel him. Somewhere in this house. Waiting. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out. I grabbed my keys, barely thinking, and stepped outside, only to freeze. Ethan was already there, sitting on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, turning something over in his hands. A keychain, I realized.
Mine.
He looked up. Neither of us spoke. I should have walked past him. I should have gotten in my car and left. Instead, I found myself standing there, my grip tightening around my keys. "Ethan." "Come with me," he said. My breath caught. What? He pushed himself to his feet, stepping down the last step until he was standing in front of me. "Just for a drive," he said. No thinking. No overanalyzing. Just come. I shook my head, already backing up. "Ethan, I can't." "You can." His voice was softer now, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "You just don't want to admit it." I swallowed, pulse hammering. "This isn't fair." He tilted his head. "To who?" I hesitated. And that was my mistake. Because in that hesitation, Ethan reached out, his fingers grazing mine as he plucked the keys from my hand. He took a step back, dangling them between us like a challenge. "Last chance, Rachel." I should have grabbed them. Should have ended it right there. But instead, I just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, I got in the car. And that was the moment I knew. There was no turning back.